I think is the most surprising thing is that nobody worked out that there might be a problem beforehand. Stop this stupid game of pretending that they are some significant player within your infrastructure framework. These structures should be ended in the same way that we would have done if the Soviets were doing it during the Cold War. Well, there's a beautiful five-star hotel and casino that's been put up in Cyprus. Unusually, though, not on the beach, as it were, but overlooking our sovereign base there. And I think the concern is that, given the sort of towering nature of the hotel, it's obviously a multi-story building with very clear views at the top into the base. The fear is that this might be being used for spying, and it is, of course, owned by a Chinese conglomerate, which increases the sort of sense of, oh, well, why would a Chinese conglomerate put this up in such an unusual position? So they've, of course, denied it. They've said nothing untoward is going on here, but it is obviously of concern, given that the base is very easily overlooked, and therefore someone watching from the hotel would be able to look at movement, look at particular planes, look at personnel, and maybe even deduce some kind of sort of tactics from those. What I think is the most surprising thing is that nobody worked out that there might be a problem beforehand. You would have thought that the sovereign base personnel would have been alarmed by the idea of a very large building going up next to it, which might then be utilized for any kind of spying. Even if it's not, it's a potential risk, isn't it? I mean, that's the whole point. So it's somewhat surprising that's been allowed to happen so far. And I think the real question is, what, if anything, can be done about it? There are ways to mitigate risk, of course, from potential spying. It happened, for example, in the Cold War, the time it happens now, when embassies, for example, have to block potential viewpoints or potential other ways of espionage. But that's obviously a challenge that we'd rather not have had in the first place. So it's awkward that this has sort of emerged and has been allowed to happen. Well, it's an obvious tactic that, to be fair to the Chinese, is used by everyone. If you've got the ability to potentially look at the military movements or intercept communications or whatever it might be of a country you're interested in learning more about, or learning what it's up to, or how you can gain a competitive or military advantage, you're going to seize the moment to do that. What it highlights is something more interesting than the obvious point, which is it is clear again that, despite all the warm words about China and its sort of potential for helping the British economy that successive governments have trotted out, what it shows you is that actually deep down everyone's aware there's a security threat from China. Everyone's aware this is not a country. Imagine the Americans, for example, had built a hotel next to the British base. Nobody would be concerned. If the French had done it, you might not be as concerned, in that sort of way. But you're very concerned if the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians are to sort of build something so obvious next door to one of your bases. And so again, it highlights the underlying story here is not so much the obvious point about a base that's been overlooked, but the fact that the people who might potentially be overlooking it are the Chinese, and therefore there's a fear the Chinese will learn things about our military, the American military, that might also use the base with spy planes and things like that, and take that news back to Beijing. And that's a more interesting story even than just the overlooking bit. Well, the Chinese are pushing the limit in a way that we have seemingly forgotten how to do. There was, of course, the story of the Chinese embassy being told it can't repress. You can't use repression in Britain. We know about Chinese police stations in Britain, which are monitoring Chinese nationals in the UK. These are all things that we know have been happening, and we've seemingly allowed to happen without much recourse to telling the Chinese that it's unacceptable. So, the reality is, as always, this is about our inability to meet the threat, as opposed to necessarily the Chinese trying it on. But they are trying it on, and they're trying it on quite successfully. And were there to be some kind of conflict down the line, the information they could get from these things would be very useful for them in any way that might lend a strategic advantage if they wanted to use it. So there are valid reasons why you would want to stop this happening now. But I come back to this point, the first and most obvious thing to recognize here is that China is a strategic threat to the UK. And once you actually say that out loud and say it several times, firstly, no one's going to say it isn't, number one. Number two, then you can start mitigating it. Then you can actually look at this the right way. And we need a government that's going to look at this properly, a government that's going to assess the threat, recognize the danger, and act accordingly to stamp it out. Well, obviously, the first step would be not to grant things like the Chinese embassy, with a communications threat to the City of London. In that way, it would be to recognise that if the Chinese cross the boundaries, whether it is through repression of their embassy or through police stations or that sort of activity, they must be not simply told don't do it, but diplomats must be kicked out. These police stations must be closed. All these structures should be ended in the same way that we would have done if the Soviets were doing it during the Cold War. We have to get real to the reality, to the situation that in 2026 we do face threats. China is clearly, at the very least, gathering intelligence about us. It is not a friend in that way, and therefore we have to do our best to stop it from doing so. And it also, of course, involves being much more alert to things like this hotel complex in Cyprus, and intervening with the Cypriot authorities, saying that's not acceptable. We can defend our own position within the UK. There's no issue there. But it's actually a mindset shift that's needed. Firstly, it's about building alliances with other like-minded powers. Because you're correct to point out, of course, that the UK on its own, compared to China, is an economic, sort of minnow in that respect. But the UK banded together with the US, with Europe, with the Anglosphere, with other democracies, becomes a much stronger force than China. And so it's about coordinating those approaches, making sure you're not hung out to dry. The Chinese have this tendency to go after individual countries if they call out China's aggressive tactics. So go collectively, make a collective move. China will be unable to respond in that sort of way. Have some confidence in your ability collectively to meet the threat as you did in the Cold War with the Soviet Union in the same way. And above all, understand the nature of what the Chinese state is and what the Chinese wish to do, both regionally in their region, but internationally as well. And make sure your economy is not dependent on China in any way for any critical national security infrastructure. Because if that's the case, and you are dependent on China, then you have handed them the keys to the castle. So it's about de-risking by removing Chinese control of any particular monopolies or any critical infrastructure you're worried about, and ensuring that there is, safety and security in your own freedom of action. What we've seen is successive governments saying, "Don't annoy them, because we need the investment. We must have Chinese investment." What investment have we had of a significant level? The previous Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, went to China having, literally kowtowed to the Chinese on all sorts of issues, and came back with £600 million of investment, a drop in the ocean from what the Chinese actually could have given. And when Keir Starmer gave the embassy, he went over, begged for Jimmy Lai's release, a British citizen being held, of course, in Hong Kong on, trumped-up charges by the Chinese, and he got nothing in response. We're not getting anything back from the Chinese, so stop this stupid game of pretending that they are some significant player within your infrastructure framework. Look for partners internationally, investment partners, who you can trust, who you don't have to worry about, who you don't have to appease in any way, shape, or form. Find those people, look to develop the British economy in that way, and then you have your answer as to how to deal with China.